Fetch better have my money. Data. Fetch better have my data. That makes more sense. Did you guys see what Rihanna did? Holy shit. Every single app requires to get data from somewhere and send data to somewhere. This back and forth is what makes the web so powerful. And the way we do that natively in JavaScript is the almighty, all-powerful Fetch API. Well, it's one of the ways, but we'll get to that. This is episode 14 of the 20 things JavaScript developers should know, but probably don't. This is episode 14. Fetch better have my data. Fetch is a function built into JavaScript that you can call to send requests to an API, just like these. History of Fetch and XHR and some of the other boring stuff at the end of the video. Okay, so how does Fetch know where to get data from if I call the function? You pass the URL into the function, and that's how Fetch knows where to go, where the request is going. You could use any API that you want as long as it's publicly accessible. So just Google free public APIs and you'll get a ton. I'll also put a bunch of links in the description below of the ones that I use. Fetch will then return a response object back to you. So keep this model in mind. That's the basic mechanism. Fetch a request and receive a response. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. One dog looks this way, the other dog looks the other way. Okay, that's a little bit oversimplified. The truth is Fetch needs more than just a URL. It actually takes a request object and returns also a response object. Both of these objects have their own properties and methods, which I'll get to in a minute. So if Fetch needs more than just a URL, how come this works? How can I just pass in a string for the URL? When you do this, JavaScript actually creates a request object for you behind the scenes and sets its URL to the string that you passed into Fetch. Kind of like this. But it also does a few other things. The same way the request needs a URL, it also needs to know what is the method of the request. For example, is it a get or is it a post? It can have different headers and cache policy and all sorts of weird and fun stuff. So if you don't set those and simply just put in a string, JavaScript assumes that's the URL and the rest of the stuff it just sets for you to the default values, which for the method is get. So these two pieces of code are effectively the same. They have the same end result. You can set all that stuff yourself manually if you need to, but if you're making a simple get request, you can just pass in the string and JavaScript will take care of the rest for you. So that's a little bit about the request. We'll see a few more examples in a second. Now let's talk about the response object, right? Which is what you get back from Fetch. But before we get to the actual response, remember Fetch is an asynchronous operation. Right? We're making a round trip to an API, to a server, to a backend. And we know it takes time. So I lied. Fetch actually doesn't return a response object. It returns a promise that would resolve into a response object eventually. And how do we handle promises? Well, I covered async programming, including promises and async await in the last 3 episodes, so go watch those if you haven't. Now, I don't know about you, but me likey some async await. So I'm gonna put an await in front of my fetch. Now, what happens when you do this, when you call this function? Your browser calls the server that's sitting on that URL and says, hey, what you got for me today, tough guy? Do you know what that movie's from? So it tries to get or fetch whatever that server returns. And we can assign the response to this variable const response. Okay, very cool. I should have the actual data that I want, right? And I can use this, right? Well, not yet. Craig, why not? Well, let's find out why. To the browser. Alrighty, so what I like to do is I like to have my URL sit in a variable. And I'm gonna copy pasta this variable, and you'll see it is the worldtimeapi.org/API. The way this API works is that you do a slash region and slash state, I guess. So what I'm looking for is the time in New York. And then what I do is I will create an async function, get data, and I'm gonna call get data. Obviously it doesn't do anything yet. Then I'm gonna do a const response like we talked about. Response equals await. What am I doing? Oh, right, fetch. That's the whole thing, right? And I'm gonna pass in the URL, and what I'm gonna get is console.log. Let's see what we got. Response. Okay, ready? Boom. Okay, we got something. We got a response with a capital R. I want to make sure you don't confuse this response with this response. This is just a local variable that I called response. I could call it R. I could call it whatever the hell I want, and we would end up with the same result. So this response, even though it is the same value of that variable, those are two different things. So response with a capital R is a special type of object. It's a response object with its own prototype. Let's see what's inside, shall we? So when we take a look, it tells me what URL I called. It tells me if the call was successful, status 200. If it was okay, true, we'll get to that in a second. Headers, blah, blah, blah. Body, it doesn't seem to have the data that I'm looking for, right? You would think maybe body has the time that I'm looking for. It's not there. But if you take a look a little bit further down, there is a JSON. It's a function, so it's not really a value that I can extract from this variable. So it has a lot of things in it, but none of them really look like the data I'm looking for, right? So now most APIs built for front-end consumption, especially, return JSON as the data. Not all, but assuming yours does, and I know that this one does, you can call the JSON method that's on the prototype of response object. And that way it will turn, I'm actually gonna call this data, and I'll change this back to response because I like response more. It's a little bit more descriptive. So data, and then I'm gonna say response dot, it can even autocomplete it for me. It says you have a method that JSON. So this will take the response and the actual body of the response and convert it into JSON. So assuming that the world API, world time API returned the actual data that is JSONable, it will give me that. So let's run that again. And well, I'm still console login response. Let's console log data. And it's a promise. So one important thing is that JSON, the method JSON, that's actually an async operation as well. So we need to await that shit too. So let's run that, and booyakasha, congratulations. We got some actual data abbreviation. This is the actual data that I was looking for, that the server is supposed to send to me. So it's telling me the time zone, it's telling me the day of the week, the day of the year, and of course the time, and all the other things that the API has promised to send to me, right? So that's pretty cool. Next, I'm gonna show you another API. This is a news API. And what this does is it just gives us the top news of the day, right? So what this is it's called api.thenewsapi.com. And there's some other stuff here, which I'll get to in a second. I don't want to change anything else. I still have to do a fetch, send the URL. Of course, this is a different URL now. And then I'll JSONify the response, and we'll go from there. Let's see what we get. This one's a little bit slower. And come on, buddy. There we go. So data. So I actually got some stuff. They gave me 2 different objects inside the response. They called one of them meta, which is how many it found, I guess, limits and blah, blah, blah. And then it's a little redundant, but they call the object inside their data also data, so it's data.data. Not great naming, but whatever. We're just looking for the actual news items. Has a title, this seems to be in Italian. And there's another one, James Bond books, rewritten to avoid offense to modern audiences. Okay, I guess that's news. And so that's another API that I just used to grab some data from, right? Let's talk about this little guy up here, API token, right? So this API requires a token, which is something that you have to add sometimes to some of your requests. It's almost like a password or your own signature, if you will. So the reason why a token is necessary is some of these APIs, even though they're free, sometimes the maintainer needs to put limits on how many times you're gonna call them. It's just so that people won't abuse their API or their service and call it a billion times a minute, right? It's not really free for them. It still costs a little bit of something. So it's important for them to know who is calling their API and how many times. So this API token that I obviously had to blur out because I don't want anybody to know what my token is, so they can't pretend to be me. That's kind of why you need to pass an API token. There are some other reasons too, but just be aware that some of the APIs you need to create an account for before you can use them. But now that brings up a really good question, right? What happens if I need to send some data to my API when I'm asking for data back? We usually call these parameters, right? How do I send parameters with a request? If you've used APIs before, you know that most of the time it's not just a simple, hey, get me stuff. It's more specific than that. It's give me all the albums of an artist with this artist ID before the year 2000, or give me all the comments of this user with this user ID for this particular asset. So usually it's a little more specific than that. So you need to send some stuff to the API to specify what you actually are looking for. So how do we do that? Good question. It depends. If your request is the method is a get, you can just URL parameters the same way I did with the API token. So I have a question mark here. If you've done this before, if you've used APIs before, you know this is how you structure an URL. Question mark, and then what comes after it is a URL parameter equals whatever the value is. And like I said, I had to blur out the value, but trust me, there is a long string of numbers and letters there that is the value of API token. So that is the contract I have with this API that says I am looking for a parameter, a URL parameter called API token. So when you call me, make sure you pass me that, and so I know who you are. So yeah, you can pass parameters in the URL if it's a GET request. But sometimes the API needs you to pass in parameters in a more secure way. So this is okay, but it's not very secure. Like some API needs you to send what's called a header or multiple headers. That's not a parameter anymore. That's a different thing that's actually called a header. To do that, you actually need to create a response object, the thing that I mentioned JavaScript does for you if you just pass in a URL. So yeah, sometimes the URL alone is not gonna cut it. So I'm gonna actually use a very fun, very cool API, the Spotify API, and fetch some data about a few bands, right? So here is the URL. I'm gonna copy paste the URL again. Let me get rid of this. So here is the URL of the Spotify API, api.spotify.com, version 1, I guess 1 and 1 is 2, /artist/ this is the artist ID, right? So this is a band that I know the artist ID for. Let's actually, you know what? We should try this first before adding whatever the Spotify API needs. So if I don't change anything, right, we're gonna see what happens when an API requires you to send additional headers in this case, and we don't. So if I run this, it says 401, no token provided. So what Spotify is telling us is that we need to send a token, what's called an access token. And the way you want to do this is through a header. So I've already gotten my access token, and this isn't a tutorial on how to use Spotify's API in particular, so that's kind of beside the point. But in order to do that, I want to show you how you can pass in headers with Fetch. So we're going to have to create our request variable, request object, new request, remember, with capital R. The first parameter is URL, and the second parameter is all the other stuff that you wanna pass in. So in this case, I want to pass in headers, and headers is an object. And what Spotify requires is something called authorization, and then the value. Actually, single quotes always. What I'm gonna do then, it requires me to pass in this value that I already attained. Apologies for the blur. Of course, I got to do that. And now instead of passing the URL to Fetch, all I have to do is pass in the request. So request, it has a little more information in it, right? It's a little more detailed, and it has not just the URL, it also has all the other things that we need. So I'm gonna then do that, and I got an error. The error is access token has expired. So it turns out that access token is something that I've used a little while ago and it has expired. So I'm going to grab the new one. Let's see if this works. Yep, and I've got the wrong ID of artist. And now I'm gonna run it. And boom, finally, we have some fun Spotify data. Okay, so let's take a look at what we actually got back. So we have the genres of the band. We have the band name, Pink Floyd. We have popularity, we have the URI. So this is the good stuff, right? This is what we wanted Spotify to give us. And what's amazing about this is I can just change the artist ID and just get a totally different set of data. Let me take a look. Let me see if these will work. Let's run that. Yep, this is for Tool. And let's see, who's next? Who's next? Or what's next, if you know what I mean. If you know, you know. So I got some Deep Purple stuff going on here. Even has the Spotify API gives me the image. I bet this is the image they use on the Spotify app. And so on and so forth. I'll do one more just for fun, because why not? Jimmy, Mr. Hendrix. So yeah, that also has some images with height and width and really fun stuff, right? So that's the happy path. That's the best case scenario where we are calling this public API. I'm passing in some secret stuff in the header, and this is how you can specify what the headers are, so you can tell Spotify who you are. So this is my token that is obviously blurred out for you, but if you go through their API, you can sort of get your own token and you can use their API. So now let's take a moment and talk about error handling. Remember when I got a 401 no token provided? How come that didn't throw an exception? And also, what do I mean by that? What do I mean that didn't throw an exception? Let's go back to the way it was. Let me do a 1, 2, 3. This is obviously the wrong bearer, but let me switch out this because now it's cached. This. So invalid access token. Doesn't matter what the error is. The point is that I'm getting an error. So this error is actually the result of a successful call, even though I didn't get the data that I wanted. As far as fetch is concerned, we succeeded. The call was successful. This means that the promise that the fetch function returned was resolved instead of rejected, even though we got an error. Shouldn't that be rejected? I mean, if you remember the promise episode, if a operation is unsuccessful, if it fails, it should reject, not resolve. So how come it resolved? And actually, I can show you the fact that it resolved might be a question to some of you because we're using async await. I'm gonna use the regular then and catch block so we can see exactly what happened. So I'm gonna get rid of this, request goes in, dot then, response. This way we can see our response.json. We can see the result and what actually happened a little easier. I want to show you that we actually don't end up in the catch block, and that's where the issue is. So if I'm just console logging my data, let's see if I missed anything. It is pending. Oh, actually I should do then, and then I can do a catch. Error, let's see what the error was. So ideally, I want to end up in the error block, right? I want to make sure that if I don't get the data I need, I would like to see an error. And I think you see where I'm going with this. This would be a success. And I want to console log the data. So let's run that. It's actually success. And it says success, but then the data is error. So how come we don't end up in the catch block, right? Well, it's a little confusing. But that's because making a successful trip to the API is considered success, regardless of what data comes back. Even if the data is status 401 and and it's an error. But if the fetch operation itself fails, meaning it can't connect to the server, it's not able to reach the server or something like that, that's when we will actually end up in the catch block. And I can prove it to you by going to some fake banana republic. Is that? No, I don't think that is an actual thing. There we go. So we end up in the error block, right? Error failed to fetch. It doesn't really tell me much. It just says that you didn't succeed because I wasn't able to complete a fetch operation. So that's really important to remember. When we get an error from fetch, that means that the fetch itself failed. But if I get an error from the server, that means the fetch operation was successful, so we need to handle it ourselves. So how do I do that? How do I handle these two different types of errors? Well, the response object has a property. Let me see if I can do data. Let's do response. So instead of doing that, instead of JSONifying it, I'm just gonna console log it for a second because I want to show you what's inside the response. So the response object has something in it called status and OK. Status 401 is 400s and 500s. You might know 404 doesn't exist. 401 is authentication error or authorization. And OK is false. So these two little properties are telling me that the response that came back from the server was a failure, but the fetch operation itself was not a failure. So now I can do a check on status and OK before I move forward, right? So let me rewrite this back the way it was. I'm gonna get rid of, I am going to actually do the function again. Async function get date. We'll bring this back and we'll write everything from scratch so we can actually see what is the best way to handle both of those. So again, we have access to our normal way of error handling promises and async await using try catch, which I'll implement in a second. And then we will do the checking of the data itself to see if the data is healthy. If that's bad, we'll handle that different error slightly differently. So what do we have? We had a response object and we put in the request and we will await that, right? Const data that came back equals await also response.json. But now here's where it gets interesting. What I can do is I can do a try catch, right? And this is, we covered this in the last episode. Doobie-doobie-doo. So console.log success, right? And then we'll put the data here. And we'll do a catch of an error. And console.log. Obviously, you can do more interesting things than console logging the error, but for today, this is good enough. So if I run this, what do I get? Invalid token. Okay, so my response has, before I do anything with it, I can check. I can say, is the response.ok true? Or I can check the status. If the status is not 200, right? Or let's do a positive case. If the status is 200, then I will continue doing what I'm supposed to do. It's a little messy, but whatevs. And I'm not handling the else. So else, that means the response was something other than 200, which we saw it's a 401. Then I can say this is the error, fetch error. No, not the fetch error. This is the server error, right? And I can get the response. I guess we can do the response. Let's do the response. Let's see what the response says. It's prototype, body. We could actually JSONify it and see what it says. So we could actually move this JSONify out and then look at the data. Because the data will be, I think it will be fine. Yeah, so the data has error in it. Data.error. That, and then we can say .message. We're getting a little messy here, but it's fine. So here's scenario where the server gave me an error, invalid token. And what if we had the bad, what did we do? Banana pudding. That is a fetch error, meaning it couldn't even complete the request. So these two different failures are up to you to handle differently. I mean, you can obviously refactor this to be nicer. You can only check for that case and then have different functions that do your error handling and whatnot. So hopefully you understand the point of error handling and why it's so important here. So those are the examples I wanted to show you on get. Post is very similar, except you have an additional property on your request object called body, and that's where you add any additional data that you need to pass to the server for your post request, right? We use post to submit forms and send data rather than get data, so that's why that body property exists. Now, there's a lot more you can read up on MDN when it comes to fetch and the request prototype and the response prototype. We didn't even cover cores and caching. There's a lot more to learn. So definitely check out MDN pages, especially this one called Using Fetch. But as always, my advice is to use it and learn by doing. And lastly, I want to spend about a minute and talk a little bit about how we arrived here with Fetch in the first place. Right? A little bit about the history of it and what other options we have when it comes to making backend requests. Fetch arrived in modern browsers a long time ago, between 2015 and 2017. And as of April of 22, Node 18 added native support for Fetch. So even though I focus mostly in these tutorials on browser behavior, anything I said today here also applies to Node 18 and later. And what do I mean by native? Native support for Fetch, it just means that you don't need to install a library or an NPM package like Axios or jQuery's Ajax for you old like me. But also Fetch is not the only way and the only native way to do this. There's actually another old school way of doing this called XML HTTP request, or XHR for short. In fact, if you look close enough in Chrome DevTools, under the network tab, there is a filter for XHR. And if you look even closer, there's even Fetch right there, right next to it. And every time a website makes an HTTP request to a server, you will see it show up under there. So go ahead and try it. Go to any website and filter by XHR and Fetch, and you'll see a lot of stuff going on. And for those who don't know, what is an HTTP request? It's a request from a client to a server, from a JavaScript app to a backend API. It's all the examples I showed you today. Getting weather information, subway schedules, user login, user information, purchasing a ticket, you name it. All that amazing stuff that you can do on the web relies on this mechanism to send and receive messages, requests back and forth between any two machines. It truly is magic. Now the obvious question, why? Why should I use Fetch? Why Fetch specifically? And why dedicate an episode to Fetch of all these other options I have? Well, the most obvious answer is that whenever you can do something natively, you probably should. Why add a third-party library unless you really have a good reason for it? And believe me, there are sometimes good reasons. In this case, Fetch supports most of the cases for modern applications. But the other reason is that the old XHR way was kind of a shit show. It's based on callbacks versus promises like we saw today. So it was a little hard to set up, it was ugly, and you ended up with some messy code. Now, this isn't a video about XHR, but I wanted to mention it because Fetch essentially achieves the same things, but with a nicer interface. Fetch really was an improvement on the syntax of XHR. Again, because it uses promises versus the old school callbacks way. So go find some killer APIs. There's a lot of them around, and Fetch better get my data. Did you guys see what Rihanna did? Holy shit. Thank you for watching, my beautiful babies. And this has been Fetch API, episode 14 of 20 things JavaScript developers should know, but probably don't. The next episode, I'm excited, will be on another native API, the almighty DOM API. The DOM API is truly almighty, and it's probably the most neglected piece of JavaScript that most people learning JavaScript will never ever get exposed to. And it is so fundamental to how we use really anything on the web by manipulating the DOM through React or Vue or any other thing that you use, even jQuery. Understanding the DOM API has been one of the most fruitful things that I've learned in the past several years. Don't forget to pick up a ColorCode t-shirt or a mug or whatever it is I sell. And I'll see you in the next episode.
Sound right, boy.